Hello, this is Ilona Thompson, Palate Exposure. I'm here at Dana Estates. Actually, the most correct pronunciation is Dana, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. And Vaso Cellars, I'm here with Chris Cooney, Director of Winemaking. We're tasting 3 wines, 2 2016 vintages and 1 2015, very exciting. So we'll be doing that throughout the conversation and kind of folding the wines into the fabric of our discussion. Thank you very much for hosting me. This has been really an eye-opening experience. This is a very special place and a very intentional one. So I can't wait to find out about your workplace, but first we'll start with a little bit about you and your background and how you came to be the Director of Winemaking. So tell us a little bit about Chris.
So I grew up in California in the South Bay, south of San Francisco, and you know, growing up, my mother is from Germany, and both my mother and father really, you know, food and family meals was really a big part of growing up. And that wine was a part of that was just sort of seemed to be like, you know, there was never a dinner without at least a glass of wine.
Cool.
And something that my dad was very passionate about. I would call him a real wine enthusiast, not a collector.
Okay.
Because he purchased wine to drink it and was very confident in what he liked and what he didn't like. But he liked some really nice wines, and so there was a good amount of, you know, first growth Bordeaux that would show up on a relatively regular basis.
Wow.
As well as other wines just from all over California, from Oregon. And that just sort of seemed like a natural thing to have at the dinner table. I didn't really get interested in wine until after college, when I was really trying to figure out what to do with my life. I have a biology degree and was trying to figure out what to do right at the end of the 90s and during the tech boom. Ended up at the end of college with my biology degree. I went and worked for Intel for a little bit. Maybe not the natural progression for a career, but I quickly discovered that sitting in a cubicle crunching numbers was really not something that really energized or invigorated me. I learned an enormous amount about Excel and about PowerPoint,
Useful.
which I still use to this day, but I'm glad that is not the focus of what I do. After that, I left to try to get back into, you know, doing something with that biology and all that science that I really loved during school, and went and worked for a consulting firm that was doing some biotech consulting, helping companies with drug development pipelines. So again, I thought it would be more engaging because it dealt more with science, but it was really the same job, just different numbers. So it was sitting in a cubicle for 10 or 12 hours a day, writing reports for people that for the most part had already made up their mind about what they were going to do with their business. And so it was a little bit soul sucking to spend all this time and then have someone like go, oh, that's nice, but I don't agree with you. And there goes your report into the trash can. And so really was during that time really trying to figure out what I could do with my life that I could be passionate about. From an early age, I have always liked cooking. I think it's my mom pushed me into it because I really, at one point in my life, I really was into pork chops, mashed potatoes, and applesauce. And I think she got sick of me asking her to make that all the time. So she finally was like, I'm just going to show you how to make this. And then whenever you ask, I can just not have to cook dinner. And so the sort of interest in cooking was something that I explored and, you know, talked to some chefs and sort of explored what it would be like to get into the restaurant industry, and quickly decided that it didn't leave me enough free time for all the things that I really like to do outside of just going to work. I love being in the outdoors. I love, you know, hiking and backpacking and, you know, biking and skiing, and, you know, got into rock climbing in college. And so, like, you know, there's just so many fun things to do, that working 6 days a week and having the schedules that chefs do, I decided that I was just going to be a passionate home cook.
Nice.
And
glad you figured it out before you got into the biz.
But through that research, I mean, it gives me an enormous respect for people that do that for a living and what they create on a daily basis. The other thing through my father, I was, I'd started thinking about wine, and sort of during that time period, he invited me to come he had a wine tasting group, and it was a group of couples where once a month someone would do a themed tasting, and then afterwards they would have dinner and they'd drink the rest of the wines from the tasting with the dinner. So it was up to the host to provide the wines and pair a dinner with the wines. And it was my father's turn to do it, and he decided he wanted to try to get a wine from every decade, and this was in the late 90s, so every decade, the 20th century. And so it was like, okay, he's gonna go back and find all these wines. And the earliest wine that he could find was a 1929 Lafite Rothschild.
Wow.
And that wine, he invited me to come to the tasting if I would agree to help cook the dinner and do all the cleanup. He's like, but I'll let you taste the wines, and that's the fee for joining the group. At that point, I was like, sure, great. I don't have anything else to do on like a Wednesday night, so like I'll do it. So after work, came over, helped them prepare dinner, and tasted through these wines. And that wine was absolutely stunning. And it wasn't, I didn't really have a trained palate at that point. I didn't really know what I was truly tasting. But what really engaged me with the wine was the amount of life it had, the fact that there was still fruit there, that it was a really interesting wine in that there was so much going on and it really tasted delicious. And for something to be that old and have been sitting in a bottle for that long, I just found truly amazing. And that just really kind of captivated me, that the way that you could, the person that made that wine, the people that were involved in growing the grapes, like just thinking about all those things, and all that's captured in this like time capsule that now, we're opening close to 70 years later, and that it's still something that you can have a sense of when it was crafted.
So that was your aha moment.
It was kind of the aha moment. It was like, wow, that's kind of cool. I mean, it wasn't immediate, like I had that bottle of wine, I'm like, oh, I want to be a winemaker. But it got me interested in wine, and I started exploring wine more and thinking about it. And it was sort of that during that time when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, when I was working at the biotech consulting firm. And it led me to have a conversation through a friend of my dad's that was part of that group with Paul Draper of Ridge Vineyards. And I'm sure Paul doesn't remember the conversation, but I just called him up, left a voicemail. And he was like away traveling, for the winery. And I was like, oh, this guy's never going to call me back. Like, okay, that was a lost, good try. But then like 2 weeks later, he called me back and was like, oh, hi, this is Paul Draper. And you left me a message, and, would now be a good time to talk. And talked to me for 45 minutes about winemaking, about what it was about. Just was very generous with his time and advice to someone that wasn't in the industry, just trying to figure out what they're trying to do with their life. And it really made me think like, wow, if like 50% of the people in the wine industry are this cool, like
I want to be in.
I would like, this sounds great, because just the different things, the way he explained it, and it's like, it's still true for me today, is like, there's such a diversity of different things you get to do, and so many different skills you get to apply. So like, I can apply the organic chemistry that I've learned at one point in my schooling. I get to apply biology in many different aspects. And there's a certain art to it as well. There's, fixing equipment, there's walking vineyards, there's like, it's just the diversity of things that you get to do, and the things you get to think about is very engaging and energizing. The number of problems you're trying to solve, like all those things, like I was like, wow, that sounds like something, sounds a hell of a lot better than what I'm doing. And it pulls in a lot of different interests I have. I love being in the outdoors. The biology, from plant biology through the yeast biology and microorganisms, through the chemistry, through at that point I wasn't even thinking about doing something like this and engaging with people that are also really passionate about wine. So that was sort of, that conversation was what pushed me to apply to Davis and go back to school to get a master's degree in enology.
Wow. So you're describing a lot of analytical attributes in your past career, but there clearly is an artistic, emotional, passionate side to you that fed into the idea of being able to apply it and make something tangible and, as you say, delicious out of it. So that's really cool that you have both sides of your brain somehow cohesively operating. Most of us are leaning heavily in one direction, put it this way.
My wife might argue with the always cohesively working together piece of it, but yeah, I mean, I'd say I come at it from a more analytical standpoint, but yeah, there is a piece of it that you have to just give up trying to analyze it and just experience. And I think it's something that I would say I didn't come to naturally, but something that I sort of, worked on evolving and building. Because I did come at it from a very scientific place of wanting to be able to analyze everything and figure out why it worked. And it's still today. I still think I come at it from more of in sort of scientific wanting to figure out why, than, well, it just is, and, just experience it.
Sure.
But that's a really important part of it. And wine it's not something where people sit down with, a piece of paper and try to analyze it.
Yeah.
It's really much more experiential. And I think that's one of the things that from growing up that I really realized that wine was something, it wasn't something you opened because you were going to do an analysis of it.
Yeah.
It was something you opened as part of a meal. It's something you opened to share with friends. It was part of sort of the social fabric of what makes us human.
Absolutely.
And it was a real piece of that. And I think that's sort of what captured, sort of my imagination about it, is that, you go through you go through the entire process of making wine from the beginning of the growing season all the way through to when you bottle it to years later after it's been aging, and just being able to share that kind of captured vintage the way that I was talking about before. It's it's kind of a time capsule, and then you're able to, you've taken that year, you've put it in a bottle, and now it's something you can put on a table and share with other people. I think is something that's really, really kind of magical about it. And I think it's one of the reasons it captures so many people's imaginations in a way that a soft drink doesn't.
Yes, very beautifully said. And by the way, I love your background. It almost feels a bit of a full circle. You clearly grew up with parents whose mindset was very European, if you will, in terms of wine and food being natural companions on the dining table. And you've absorbed it, from the early age as part of the fabric, the miniculture in your family. And then you went and created this you built out this foundational aspects of science and biology and biochemistry that you can draw from. And then you went into the career that basically takes you back to those emotional aspects. So yeah, it's pretty fantastic how it all worked out. So you got your master's degree, and what happened next?
So during getting the master's, I worked a vintage at Iron Horse over in Sonoma.
Sparkling, huh?
Sparkling, but also still Pinot Chard. And then I think they've sold it now, but they also had a great Cabernet vineyard up in Alexander Valley.
I don't think I've had their Cabernet.
And yeah, it was a great experience. David Monksgaard, who was the winemaker there at the time, I don't know if he's still there, but he was just a really great mentor in terms of I had a lot of things rattling around in my head, but how do you actually apply those and actually get something done in a winery? I believe he was ex-Marine, and he had just the right amount of kind of drill sergeant and mentor. So it was a really great experience that I really, really enjoyed.
Very cool.
And I did that sort of in between the two sort of halves of the master's degree. And then after that, I went to Germany for a harvest because I had met a winemaker that had come over from Germany with a group to Davis.
Okay.
And I basically it was a group of winemakers from the Pfalz region of Germany, and it was basically anybody want an intern? I got myself into this tasting through Ann Noble, even though I wasn't one of her censor students, but I just kept bugging her until she like let me join this tasting with this group of German winemakers. So that's how I ended up over there. And that was, again, a very wonderful experience, like working with varietals that I'd never worked with. I spoke German, but they don't speak German in the Pfalz. They speak a dialect. And so it took me a little while to actually be able to communicate with anyone. Luckily, the winemaker and his wife spoke what they call Hochdeutsch or High German, which is like what they learn in school. So like at least I had someone I could converse with.
But experience had to be really eye-opening.
Oh, I mean, it was really wonderful, and it was, you know, doing so many things in a small winery, and just like in a very different way than any other winery I've worked at. And after that, I came back. I worked on my thesis over the holidays after the harvest, and then went to Australia and worked in the Yarra Valley in Australia for a harvest. And then after that, came back and was like really looking for what's my next thing. Finished my thesis up, turned that in.
What was the subject?
It was basically a proteomic analysis of yeast during a normal fermentation. So a lot of the proteomic analysis that had been done up to that point was looking at yeast, but looking at it in a 2% sugar solution. So not very much alcohol is involved. And so the way that the yeast is going to express proteins is going to be very different in a wine fermentation where it's getting up to 12 or 14%, or in Napa Valley even higher, is going to be very different because it's dealing with different stresses. And so the idea was to try to set some baselines as to like, can we figure out what proteins are going to be differentially expressed?
Fascinating. I mean, especially for wine nerds. What a fantastic, did you come up with that subject matter spontaneously, or is it something that caught your attention?
Generally the way it works is you have, you know, as a master's student, you're not there for like 6 years doing a PhD. And so you're trying to latch on to something that's interesting to you, that's part of a professor's area of research. So I worked in Linda Bassan's lab, and, you know, sort of in conjunction with her of like, oh, here's this chunk of research that we need to do that's part of this larger project. You know, why don't you take on this piece of it?
Got it.
And so, you know, it's one of those things that I always sort of think about. It was very educational from me understanding that I didn't want to be a research scientist. And really, you know, getting a full lab experience and knowing that I wouldn't want to be in a lab and do a PhD. But being given that opportunity to do that as well was just a great experience. To sort of be working on the basic research that, you know, you've been reading papers and all this stuff for years. It's like, oh wow, now I'm actually doing this stuff that's actually maybe going to lead to someone publishing a scientific article. So it was fun, but it wasn't, I'd say it wasn't my cup of tea.
It wasn't anything. It's amazing how much we learn if we actually listen to ourselves from what we don't like. I think it's just as important to know what's not your thing, what doesn't appeal to you. Because you describe a couple of pivotal moments in life, especially early on when you had a secure job and by all accounts, great career. But you recognized and acknowledged that this is not something you want to dedicate your life to. And therefore, things showed up in your life path that you've embraced subsequently. But it's important to give yourself permission to say, it's okay not to like it and act on it.
Yeah, like the pizza delivery job that I had during college. Decided that being in the pizza business is not going to be my passion.
There you go.
Same thing with being a barista. I absolutely adore coffee, but I just couldn't, you know, I did it for a whole summer and it was like, that's more than enough for me on this particular job.
Well, you obviously have an ability to acknowledge, you know, you're connected to yourself, that you have a very good idea of what aligns with what doesn't, and you pursue things that do, which I think is an important life lesson in a larger sense. So we left off when you were in Australia or post-Australian internship in Yarra Valley, and then you came to Napa or just back to the Bay Area?
Well, no, I came back to the Bay Area, but I was looking for a job, and one of the people I had worked with, he had been working at Acacia.
Oh, okay.
And he was a little sort of ahead of me in the on his wine journey. And so I was talking to him, I was like, I'm looking for an internship. Do you have any ideas? And he's like, well, I need to hire an intern. You want to work for me for Harvest? So I was hired on at Acacia to help them for the harvest, and doing Pinot and Chardonnay, they were done very early, and that year, and they were part of the Chalon wine group, and so I was done like maybe end of September. I'm like, oh great, I was thinking I was going to work till at least like end of October, and they're like, yeah, but there's another position up at Moon Mountain. They need someone up there because they're a little short-staffed or somebody had fallen through, and so I went up there. And Moon Mountain and Dynamite were sort of together as a brand, and they had another facility, and it ended up being that they moved me down there and had me running basically the whole crush operation and everything down there. And so that lasted me through after Christmas, and at that point I was like, okay, I got to find a real job. And so the winemaker for the Dynamite brand put me in contact with Tom Rinaldi, who was starting Provenance, and had an interview with him for an assistant winemaker position that he had open.
Very cool.
And at that point, I still hadn't gotten my official paperwork from Davis, and so they wouldn't hire me as assistant winemaker. So they're like, no, you can only be the enologist because you don't have a degree, an official degree. That was the policy of the company at the time. So I started as an enologist, working for Tom at Provenance, and that was in 2003. And so I worked there for, about 11 years, sort of learning a huge amount of stuff. Working with Tom is always an adventure.
So I hear.
And, really learned an enormous amount of things about winemaking. Got to work with vineyards all over Napa Valley. So that was a real education of not really having a lot of our own vineyards for the Provenance brand. And so really being able to explore and learn about the different parts of Napa Valley, the different terroirs, like how the wines were different, coming off of these different parcels. It was really a great education.
Sounds like it.
As well as working with a vineyard that they purchased a couple of years after I started, the Hewitt Vineyard, which had traditionally been going into the George Delatour wines. And as we were slowly pulling back all the grapes from BV, Diageo Chateau and Estates, which owned BV, purchased the Chalon wine group.
Oh, wow.
And so it was sort of like, oh, those grapes are disappearing. Oh, let's just buy the whole the whole wine group.
Yeah.
So that it was actually, from my standpoint, being in winemaking was really positive because they had much deeper pockets.
Sure.
They're more willing to invest in capital. And so all of a sudden, all those things you couldn't get in the small company, all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, you need this? Okay, yeah, we can do that.
Nice.
So it was also a really great learning experience in the business of wine. Slowly getting promoted up, from enologist to assistant winemaker to associate winemaker, that sort of moving through and then exploring different parts of the industry, really kind of taught me a lot in terms of like the entire, what is the entire business of being a winemaker, because there are pieces to it that aren't just specifically making wine, because being the person behind directing the crafting of the wine, a lot of times also that's the people that the restaurateur wants to talk to.
Yes.
That the consumer wants to talk to. They really want to hear about the story of the wine from the person that was directing the making of the wine.
Of course.
Or actually making the wine. And I say that very deliberately because, making wine is not, for the most part, an individual pursuit. It's a pursuit of a team of people that are working together. And having a great team of people really better allows you to achieve what you're trying to do with the wines. And so, in some cases it is one person doing it all by themselves, but I think that's a very rare case.
So that public persona that you've developed and evolved, how does that feel to you, being kind of the ambassador for your craft?
I would say it's something that does not come naturally. I'd much rather be in the back in the winery, like, you know, putting a blend together or walking a vineyard.
Yes. But you do it so well. You gave me a fantastic tour and a lot of insight. It was absolutely fascinating. You obviously have a tremendous breadth and depth to your perception. Really, in terms of the winemaking skills, clearly you have a formidable set of those, but you have such a relationship with the craft that comes through when you speak about it, that it's, you know, it's undeniable. So for what it's worth, you give really good storytelling.
Thank you.
So we have some wine in front of us, and maybe we can taste one of those as we continue our conversation, because quite frankly, I can't take it anymore. I'm so excited to taste it. Where should we start?
Why don't we start with the Vaso?
The Vaso.
So Vaso is sort of the newest wine to join the Donna Estates family of wines. In a way, it's new and old at the same time. We've been sort of working on this wine for years, and has been sold into Korea since 2008. Was the first year that it was in the Korean market, and we just released it about 18 months ago internationally. So that's U.S. market and other international markets that we sell wine in. So what's exciting about this, to me, what's really exciting about the wine is that it sort of captures all of our different vineyards that we're farming, and sort of captures the overall philosophy of what Donna Estates is trying to do in a wine that's more accessible to a larger audience. So we were talking about, Dana, which is a Sanskrit word, coming back to this, which is it's a Sanskrit word that means spirit of generosity. And, it's the nickname given to our founder, Mr. Lee, by a Buddhist monk. And Mr. Lee really embodies that philosophy of generosity. And with the single vineyard wines from Donna Estates, we're just not able to produce that much, which feels very ungenerous in a certain way. And that's something that's definitely been, we talk about at the winery. And so Vaso is a way for us to be able to share sort of our passion and our philosophy of, growing grapes and making wine with a larger audience than we can with our single vineyard wines.
Makes a lot of sense. It smells fantastic.
So this is the 2015 vintage that we're trying today. And I'd say the backbone of the wine comes from our Hershey vineyard. But it is a blend of all four vineyards. So our Hershey vineyard, our Crystal Springs vineyard, our Lotus vineyard, and our Helms vineyard. And all four of those vineyards are estate, and we're farming them all organically and have been since around 2009. It's like kind of a 3-year lead time to get it certified.
Yes.
But ever since, it was sort of one of the first things we did from a farming perspective was to convert over to organic farming for all of our vineyards.
Oh, that's fantastic to hear that. Look at the legs on this. I know you guys that are listening can't see it, but it has quite a bit of presence, just even looking at it in the glass. So 15, you said, was an interesting vintage. A lot of people in the valley experienced some shorter crops. For you, it was more of an early vintage, right?
Yeah, I'd say the crop was smaller, a little better than 2011, which is another really short vintage in terms of volume. But yeah, it was an early vintage in terms of, we had very early bud break, and so the season really got off to an early start. So in terms of the total growing season time, it wasn't really dramatically shorter than something like 2016. It's just that everything was shifted earlier in the year.
Got it. Wow.
So I think the wines from 2015 really still retain a lot of freshness and brightness.
Indeed.
But because of that kind of warmer finish to the season, they're still capturing that kind of warmer Napa Valley fruit profile, that I think is something that I think people find very appealing about Napa, is that
Like the ability qualities.
Yeah, that it's kind of almost sort of a richness to the fruit. One of the things that we're trying to do with all of our wines is really trying to find that balance, where there's a balance between the acidity and the fruit and the tannin, and trying to find exactly where within that triangle for each of the different wines we can really keep the wines being fresh and bright, while still having the structure and the fruit that people are expecting from a Cabernet from Napa Valley.
It's quite a silky mouthfeel. The texture is brilliant. It is very fresh. It's exceptionally pleasurable. I love. So we left you in 2014, I believe, when you were working with a multitude of different resources and had quite a panoply of vineyards that you're drawing experience and expertise from and working with. Is that when you met Mr. Lee, or? So
how I ended up at Donna from sort of end of 2014 was that I'd been at Provenance and Hewitt for quite a while at that point, and was looking to, sort of transition to something smaller. Wasn't sure whether it was smaller and family owned or, something where I could have a more direct connection to the vineyards.
Sure.
Because something that became clear throughout the years working at Provenance was that the parent company, Diageo, as they sort of dug deeper and deeper into the wine industry, it became apparent to me that they didn't really understand it, and at some point they were going to offload, even though they, Larry Schwartz, the guy that was running it for the U.S. operations at the time, and even Ivan Menendez, who is the CEO of them globally, like, it's just like they would say one thing and you could just see other things happening in the mechanics of the way they ran the business, and you're like, you guys just don't understand that you're going to have to get rid of this at some point. So to me, that was a clear sign that, like, who knows who the next person is just going to own it, but I need to do something different. And plus, it was a time in my life where I was really just ready to take on a new challenge, and work with some different vineyards and do something different. Someone that I'd gone to Davis with had been working at Donna Estates, and he was basically leaving to pursue his sort of first passion, which was sailing, he and his wife had bought a boat and were going to sail around the world with their two girls. And so he was going to be leaving a position at Donna, and he contacted me and said, I know you're looking for something new, would this be something you might be interested in? Do you want to come meet with Mr. Lee and talk about the opportunity? So it was at the end of 2014 that I met with Mr. Lee, and sort of like, we sort of hit it off and thought it would be a good fit from both sides, that this would be something that would be something for me, something fun to do and a new challenge. And that I obviously had a skill set that he thought would be something that would allow him to, continue making wines in the style and to pursue his philosophical goals of how he wants the wines to be. So it was a good meeting. Let's just put it that way.
So far the hallmarks, what you're describing with respect to your life path, is a lot of hard work, a lot of intensely hard work from what I'm hearing, and serendipity.
Well, isn't that the way life always is?
Yes, hopefully. So that fateful meeting obviously resulted in you taking a job here. What did it look like when you first started?
So the initial first month, because I had a 1 month overlap with my predecessor, so there was a huge amount of just learning and having him offloading information about what he had accumulated over the previous 10 years that he had been here. So it was a real giant data dump and me taking a lot of notes. But also really a realization like, wow, this is going to be really fun. Like there's so much that we still don't know. There's so much still to work on. There's so many things, not only to learn and wrap my head around, but like just great vineyards that I'm going to get to work with. It's kind of almost this like, almost feel a little bit like blessed from the like, wow, I'm going to be put in charge of these raw materials and I'm going to get to make wine out of this. This is cool. Like, it's just a really kind of fun, it was just very fun and exciting to be able to step into something where you have the ability to not only take it from to the raw material all the way through the winemaking process into the bottle, but really have the ability to really make, to shape that at every step of the process.
Have you tasted Donna wines before?
Yes, I had, through my friend Cameron.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I would assume so. So did you like them? What did you think?
I would say that I definitely liked them,
Right.
but they were harder for me to wrap my head around the first couple of times that I had them, because they were very different from what I would sort of describe as a typical Napa Valley wine.
Okay.
And I think in some cases, sometimes that's a little bit of a shock sometimes to people when they taste our wines. It's that they're maybe a little bit unexpected.
Okay.
In terms of trying to, because philosophically trying to make wines that have that balance of acidity in addition to structure and fruit. I'd say really it's the acidity piece of it that I think is sort of, people aren't expecting that.
Okay.
That acidity to be combined with sort of the creamy texture that has that underlying structure.
Sure.
So,
it kind of give you a preview, it sounds like, of what the capabilities are and what the inherent characteristics may be.
Yeah.
And maybe wines that you tasted had more of an old world feel to them. Is that
I would say a little bit. But like with anything, I think one of the things that I really, liked about Mr. Lee and his sort of vision was that, Donna Estates to him wasn't something that he was looking to have be, to build and have it hit its peak at 5 years. It was really a long-term vision and almost more of a generational vision, an attempt to build something that was going to be around for generations. And so a real understanding that it was going to take time to understand the vineyards.
Yeah.
If you think about some of the great wines of the world, people have been working those vineyards for hundreds of years, and they just have a deep understanding that is very difficult to accumulate in 5 years.
Of course.
Because just to see one cycle from, let's say the beginning of the season where you prune the vines to when you bottle the wine is 3 years. And that's a freshly bottled wine that you still need another year to really kind of wrap your head around and see how all those decisions you made in those previous 3 years are going to start to play out, let alone really play out in, the aging of the wine in 5 to 10 years.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's a constant, learning and iterating on what you've learned. And a lot of times those learnings, you don't see things in the wine that you can relate back to something that happened in the vintage or in terms of how you did something in the vineyard or in the winery. Sometimes it takes a long time to actually not only see it happen in the wine, but also to tease that out and figure those things out. Some things are much quicker and you can see them more rapidly. But I think some of the nuances and some of the finer points sometimes take a long time to work out.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I'm not going to have perfected what the vineyards I'm working with can achieve in my career, but that's part of what makes it fun, is that you can always do something different and hopefully do it better than you did it before.
Sounds like an art of patience, and clearly Donna Estates practice an intensely thoughtful, insightful, very deliberate approach to every aspect, from the ground to the cellar, and everything is very meticulously thought through. Obviously, you don't know what the final result will be. That reveals itself. but the initial mindset that permeates your brand is extreme attention to detail, and studying everything and examining everything, right? And that feeds into your analytical side quite well, I would imagine.
I naturally gravitate towards that aspect of things.
Yes, yes. But then you also talked about letting go and the hands off. So how do you balance the two?
I would say that, like we talked about before, like I do love data, but at a certain time, it's understanding what's the end goal of what you're trying to do, and it's the same thing in the vineyard. You can collect a huge amount of information, and that information, the important thing is what do you do with it, and how do you use it to try to achieve your goal. Like collecting information for the sake of collecting information, as I sort of learned in the research environment, is like at a certain point you're just kind of spinning your wheels, and you sort of can get bogged down by too much. But sometimes you have to collect that data for a long time to be able to analyze it, to realize that it's the wrong data to be collecting, and it points you in a new direction. And so being able to try to figure out what is the relevant data that's going to allow you to change the way that the wine tastes, and that you can make a wine that's more representative of place through maybe taking more action, but maybe taking less action. So a lot of times I would say, like, I collect a lot of data that then informs me that I shouldn't do anything, but I'm making an informed choice not to do something.
And how you develop that filter? Is it just experience, understanding what needs to happen versus what
I think it's experience, but it's also running lots of like mini experiments. So like they're not scientific experiments in terms of like, it's a double-blinded control and you be able to control every variable and run something that is publishable in a journal, but it's something that's relevant for your wine or your vineyard, and being able to learn something from that in a way that helps move you in a direction. And I'd say I probably go a little bit overkill on really wanting controls and okay, we got to do it the old way here, and here's 2 new ways, and then we got to make the wine out of it. We can't just observe it in the vineyard, it's got to translate into the wine. So I'd say I do complicate my life, and the life of not only the vineyard team, but also the cellar team, and in ways that probably they find a little bit frustrating, but really trying to then take those experiments and take them back to them and show them, like, here, we did all this, you did all this extra work so that we could try to tease out some difference. Here's the result. And like, yeah, we have an answer, or, look, it's the way science is sometimes, and doing experiments, sometimes you don't get a result. So we should repeat it next year. Or we should not repeat it next year, but bringing it back so that everyone is on board and everyone can learn from the experience, I think is valuable, because oftentimes someone else comes up with a better idea of like, oh, well, you tried this. Yeah. Have you thought, what if we did that? It's like, oh, I hadn't thought of doing that. Like, so it's what I also find really fun about making wine, is that it's also a team exercise, and that, that you kind of you're learning from a really diverse group of people. Yeah. And sometimes it takes you in directions that you weren't really thinking. So
I love that kind of open-mindedness, and also I value critical thinking a great deal, and what you described certainly feeds into that you push yourself, you push your team. You don't just take something at face value and say that's how it's been done, what I read or experienced at other brands, this is not good enough. I'm going to find out. I'm going to get to the bottom of it. And things reveal themselves along the way that you may not expect. Fantastic. Has there been an instance or a vintage that just really threw you for a loop, where things just didn't make sense? I'm thinking maybe 2011, or maybe some other set of circumstances that just really gave you a hard time.
I'd say maybe it's just because it's in more recent memory, but I'd say 2017 was one of those vintages where it was just it sort of changed the way that I think about growing grapes in warm climates. And the reason I say that is, the start to the growing season, we had a lot of rain, there was a lot of soil moisture starting the growing season. There was a lot of challenges with that in terms of like having a lot of shoot growth. And so having canopies, and you never know exactly where your season is going. So how exactly are you going to manage sort of the horsepower of the vine, and you're trying to forecast what's going to happen later. And thinking that the season was really going to go in a certain direction, and that it was, we have, sort of the vines have a little more leaf area. How are we going to manage that? Is that going to be an accelerated ripening, whether it's, warmer or cool? And how are we going to manage that to make sure that we have physiological ripeness? So we have all the flavors and textures that are going to be inherent in those grapes that are going to translate to the wine. And then having the beginning of September, having that just crushing heat wave that wasn't 1 day or 2 days.
Yes.
It was, 110 plus for 6 days. Was really unexpected. And to see what the vines did in that scenario, where they really almost behaved like it was too cold, in that they shut down, they stopped ripening, and they kind of went into hibernation in a similar way to when it's really cold out. And if you have a really cold vintage like 2011, oh man, the ripening is really slow. Like, are these grapes ever going to ripen? Sugar accumulation in the grapes literally came to a complete screeching halt. And I'd never seen anything like that. And you're thinking it's hot, but you're seeing this other kind of pattern behavior in the grapes, and you're like, they've shut down. They're not ripening. The tannins aren't ripening. Aroma and flavor molecules aren't accumulating because there's no sugar going into the berry. So none of that transport mechanism is happening. And how are we now going to react to that? And how is that going to inform when we pick our grapes?
Of course.
I'd say that really was a real curveball. And picked a couple of lots on the earlier side, and ended up really not liking those lots and declassifying those. But sort of, having that patience to wait and really trying to ignore certain, like, it's hot, things should be accelerating, we should be picking faster or sooner. I'd say that was a really difficult sort of, puzzle to kind of figure out that was not the right decision for our vineyards, and to really just hold on and wait. I'd say it was something completely new and kind of a real curveball, and sort of changed the way that I think about, in a fundamental way, think about how I think about heat and, climate change and growing grapes in a warm climate, because there's a lot of talk of that. I was like, is Cabernet going to be a varietal we're going to be able to grow in Napa in 50 years? Yeah.
No, it sounds like a lot of sensitivity to the vine as a living organism in every aspect, but also sensibility. Like, it had to have been a really difficult moment, because in the wine business, you have one shot a year. And
you can't unpick the grapes.
Exactly.
Oh no, put them back.
So how nerve-wracking it must have been when you're watching those numbers and tasting and realizing, I don't know how to wrap my head around it. Wow. And how did it turn out in the end? Are you pleased?
I'm very happy with the wines. They took a while to kind of come around. So right after harvest, they were a little bit more challenging to kind of figure out where they were going. And but now that we have all the 17s in bottle, I'm very happy with where they came out.
It must feel very gratifying.
I mean, it's
given the stress.
Yeah, it's nice to have them in bottle and be really happy about what's there.
Yes.
And again, it's like, it's an educational, I look at it as like, oh, I've learned something really interesting from this really unique set of circumstances that Mother Nature threw at us.
Absolutely. There's a lot of complaining about 2011 because it was such a cool vintage and such an inconsistent growing season, but 2017 for the most part is regarded as a warm vintage, clearly with some heat spikes. But overall, there seems to be a lot of more negative value assigned to cooler and weather events than to warmer the conventional wisdom would say in Napa we have fantastic weather, you know, typically very even growing seasons. So it can be a problem, but here we are facing, you know, a monumental issue that could have turned into a disaster. So congratulations on managing it well.
Well, I mean, if you compare it to 2011, again, like I think there were some just absolutely beautiful wines made in 2011.
Indeed.
And there's this sort of negativity associated with the vintage, but like, I mean, some of my favorite Cabernets from Napa Valley come from the 2011 vintage, and it's because that, you know, they, you know, in the instances where people were really thoughtful about the decisions that they made, the wines have just a poise and a precision that I think in some vintages that are more kind of classic Napa Valley vintages, the wines don't have. And to me, that's something that I enjoy. And as we talked about earlier, it's like every wine has to go into an individual's mouth and be consumed. And so it's a very personal, individualistic thing about like what wine is right for different people. And so like from my perspective, I quite enjoy the 2011s and really think it's you know, for people that made some good decisions in the vineyard and were very thoughtful, the wines are brilliant.
I absolutely agree. It reminds me of 1998 that suffered a similar fate in terms of perception, but the longevity and the elegance, and to borrow a word from you, precision, is remarkable. So I quite enjoyed my 98s while people were chasing 97 still, and then realizing that perhaps 98 is quite worthwhile.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, it's like, oh, 97 is this great vintage, and it's like, it didn't quite age the way that people were thinking it was going to.
Absolutely. So what are we trying next? I know the others at 2016, which you said is one of your favorite vintages of late. So the second wine is?
The second wine is, it's also a blend, sort of hillside Cabernet blend. This is Onda.
Onda.
And Onda's wine we started making in 2007. And it's sort of like, its backbone is at our Crystal Springs vineyard, which sits above the Silverado Trail, sort of right between St. Helena and Calistoga on the eastern hills. And, you know, it really is kind of a little bit, you know, comparing it to Vaso, the site has a little bit sort of what I would call sort of a little bit warmer expression of Cabernet, a little broader on the mouth. And from, you know, the backbone being from Crystal Springs, having a little bit more heat, because the vineyard is about 30 degrees in steepness on the side of a hill facing sort of southwest. So the vines really get a lot of, you know, intense sunshine throughout the growing season, and I think it really gets captured in the wine.
Wow, I can't wait to try it. I was noting a darker color as well. Completely different mouthfeel, you know, tannin quality, but my God, is that a powerhouse? So
a little bit more structured wine. Also, we're looking at a vintage difference as well. The 2015s is a really interesting vintage, coming back to the Vaso. One thing that I found really interesting about 2015 is if you look at the number of seeds you find in grape berries, there was a lot fewer seeds in 2015, which means you're going to have less seed tannin that's going to make it into the wine, which to me kind of creates a backbone off of which the other tannins in the wine can sort of, you know, hang off of. It's sort of like the framing of your house.
Yes.
And so the 2015s really have a silkiness to them because of that decrease in the seed tannin in the wines.
Wow. The finish. I'm still tasting it. It's very distracting, by the way. I'm totally listening, but it's like this wine has really such presence and such mouthfeel.
I kind of feel like wine tasting on a podcast is like kind of cruel to the listener.
Yes, it is. Thank you for saying it, because I apologize profusely. I feel quite self-indulgent right now because I am tasting something quite special and you guys are just hearing about it.
I have purchased quite a few wines from listening to podcasts on wine.
Good. See, that's the key for you guys.
I hear about like, some property or, you know, some winemaker talking about their wines. I'm like, wow, I really got to try that. Like, you know, and then go out and like, then I spend another 15 minutes online trying to find the wine.
I like that. It's actionable that way. And your wines, since we're on the subject, are available for purchase on the website, or is there, I understand that you have a mailing list.
Yeah, so you can call the winery, and we can, with Vaso, it's available for sale.
Okay.
And then with Onda and Donna, people should just call the winery.
Got it. While we were walking around the facility, you said something that really caught my attention, which is the overarching philosophy for your wines. World class, not necessarily Napa context exclusively, clearly it's grown here. But in terms of the world stage, this wines are meant to be contenders. Is that accurate?
I would say that that's the philosophical underpinnings of what the goal of the winery is. But I think there's a real, you know, starting with Mr. Lee, that is not, you know, like I was saying before, that's a long-term vision.
Yes.
And that's the sort of the goal of what we're trying to achieve. And I'm going to leave it to others whether we've like actually achieved that or not. Because I think it's a little bit difficult sometimes to have that perspective when you get so immersed in, you know, the production of, you know, of wines. Sometimes while you can taste wines from all over the world, sometimes you become a little bit myopic in terms of like the hyper focus on different sites. But yeah, that's sort of the overarching goal, is to try to make wines that you know, hopefully in 50 years will be looked back upon in the same way that I looked upon that 1929, you know, Lafite. That it's like, wow, it's going to open somebody's eyes and be something that's a really special experience.
Well, if you're to believe scoring system and critics, you can't get enough of your wine. It's so well reviewed. Uniformly, you get fantastic scores. What I'm tasting here today bespeaks exactly what you described. It's a wine I want to keep going back to. It's something that is very intellectually stimulating as well as palatally. It has that freshness, which almost is counterintuitive when you think in the context of the wine that's big and voluminous and texturally sound and has a tannin value and acidic value. So you've achieved something that's quite remarkable. You mentioned earlier about the ballerina reference of something that's so powerful and so well trained and so poised, but yet so elegant and so easy on the eyes. It makes it look effortless. I think that actually describes your wines quite well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's so many analogies that you can use to describe wines, and it's interesting how many different like analogies people use to how do we sort of try to describe what we're tasting, because we're very visual creatures.
Yep.
And how do we translate what we're perceiving through sort of like, you know, the senses of, you know, it's not really taste, but, you know, taste and smell, you know, more so the smell, and how do we translate that into a way that we can communicate with someone else? And, you know, that I use that reference because I think it captures in a way that I think a broader audience can really understand of like what we're trying, you know, what the goal is, or the hope to achieve. Is it a wine that will have something similar to this ballerina reference of, you know, not only power, but the amazing precision and poise. I think it's just like, to me it sort of speaks to me when I think of, you know, analogies, and how can I create an analogy of what I'm trying to do in the wine to something that is maybe a little bit easier for other people to understand.
You know, the language of wine always fascinated me. There's of course the lingo that's used by the media and the nerds and such like that, and there's quite a bit of repetition there. And then there's the consumer that is a bit hesitant. There's a lot of trepidation of saying the wrong thing. I'm sure you've heard people say, well, I don't know if I'm describing it right. And I think it's important to describe it in your own words and what it means to you. And that in and out of itself brings so much value to the experience.
I think the other thing that I really try to impress upon people is it's not that you don't have the right words, it's that you're still having that experience. And whether you can articulate like a wine critic and wax poetic about the wine really has no relevance on whether you enjoy the wine or not.
Right.
Your inability to have trained to describe it just comes down to, have you tasted wine and really tried to assign vocabulary to each individual sensation you have in your mouth? Well, that's a specific skill that someone has really worked to hone.
Sure.
But it doesn't have any impact on whether you can enjoy the wine or not. And so I try to let people know that like, it's not your inability to describe the wine that changes your enjoyment of the wine. It just means that it makes it harder for you to have a conversation around the wine because you can't articulate yourself.
I think that's so important. I just want to kind of pause on this for a moment and flesh it out. I sometimes think of it as a Jedi power moment, when you literally close your eyes and let yourself feel that power, even without training, right? So relating to wine to me is a very personalized exercise, and it's yours and yours alone. There's a greater context, obviously the social fabric and where you are and all sorts of bits and pieces that contribute to the experience. But at the end of the day, it's you and the wine and how it lands on you. And what you're essentially saying is that don't be afraid to experience it, and however you express it or not, it's still a sound, complete moment that you get to enjoy. So do that instead of worrying what is it you're going to say or how you're going to sound, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, when I probably experienced one of the best wines I've ever tasted in my life, I couldn't describe what I was feeling, how the wine tasted. Mm-hmm. I couldn't articulate any of that.
Yeah.
I just had an emotional experience by tasting it, and it's like emotional, but also just a pleasurable experience of like, I just put something in my mouth that tastes really good. And so like, I think if people distill it back to something a little bit more basic, mm-hmm. maybe that piques their interest and they want to learn more. They want to build their skills to be able to have an intellectual conversation around, mm-hmm. The differences between, different properties in Burgundy or different single vineyards in Napa. Like, yeah, anyone can learn to do that. It's just a matter of whether that's something that they want to spend their free time doing. Mm-hmm. Or in some cases, their professional time doing.
Yep.
But that doesn't mean that every single person can't have that same pleasurable experience, even if they can't engage in that next level of.
Absolutely. And it's a bit of a time travel too, isn't it? Because you get to experience something that took several years to come together, and so many hands have touched it, from the vineyard workers to you to the cellar hands, and finally it comes to your table, or the sommelier that also tasted it prior to you. So there's a pretty long chain of participants, and then you get to not just evaluate and taste it, but you get to truly experience what that means. And I think that in that of itself is such an important part. I think the consumer, not from the judgment day point of view, but from really appreciating what it took to bring it to the table. And when you taste internationally, then you get to travel to that region mentally because it's unique unto itself. So wine number 3, 2016.
So this is 2016. This is from our Hershey vineyard. So
Yes.
This is one of the Donna single vineyard wines. Mm-hmm. This is one of the first 3 wines that the winery produced. It's sort mm-hmm. of the wines that we're producing. This is the Hershey vineyard. We also have the Lotus vineyard and the Helms vineyard, mm-hmm. which were sort of the trifecta of wines that the winery was sort of founded around. Mm-hmm. So the Hershey vineyards are our highest site up on Howell Mountain. Mm-hmm. And the 2016, I don't know, I'm really excited about this wine. It's one of the wines that I guess I get sort of most excited about creating, because there's the most challenges in terms of the complexity of the vineyard. And so the blending to me is sort of the most I guess, challenging of the 3 single vineyard wines.
Wow. The nose is very different. I mean, they're all different, clearly, different origin, but also just in terms of the quality, it's more reserved. And of course, mountain fruit would suggest that there's more energy and tightness, theoretically speaking. And now that I've tasted, I can validate there's definitely that tension that you feel.
And there's also, one of the things I think is a real sort of signature of the site is there's a minerality that really underlies underlies the wine, and get it both in what I find very fascinating is that there's this like minerality or whetstone character that comes out not only in the Cabernet but also in the Sauvignon Blanc we make from the same site.
Oh my goodness.
So really, talking about a sense of place and a sense of like, is there sort of a signature characteristic of the vineyard?
Yeah.
It's interesting to be able to see that within 2 very different grape varietals.
Very interesting. And you've highlighted minerality, which I think also sometimes can be confusing to the consumer. What does it mean to you?
To me, it's a character. I think the easiest way sometimes to describe it is it's almost more of a smell than it is really a taste. So if you think about the fact you really only have 5 tastes, and everything else is smell. So it's really, to me, it's reminiscent of rain in the mountains. And so I specifically, coming from California, I spent a lot of times in the Sierra where it's mostly granite. And so to me, it's very reminiscent of sort of summer rain on warm granite in the Sierras.
What a poetic description.
And so, but I think you can get similar notes like, rain on concrete, rain on, different types of rocks. There's a certain kind of like aromatic that you get. And to me, it really hits on the very late finish, which is where you're getting sort of that retronasal, after you swallow the wine, there's kind of that little kick.
Yes.
That's where, to me, it really comes from.
That's fantastic.
And that's sort of how I would describe it. What is that flavor?
Yes, thank you. So obviously you work with blends as well as individual standalone, and we had a discussion about various sites vis-a-vis the blends and what is really the value proposition for somebody who maybe is not as well versed in what that really means. So how would you describe, and what do you think are the most salient points of that?
Sorry, of the different sort of the different approaches to the blending.
Different approaches to like what motivates and constitutes the blend versus the single origin wine, single varietal, a single site.
I mean, one of the things that I think sometimes people think single origin or single site wines mean that there's no blending involved. There's still blending.
Got it.
Even if you're taking one lot of grapes that goes into one tank, it goes into multiple barrels, and all those barrels are going to have their own personality, and you're potentially going to be putting a wine together from those barrels. For our single vineyard wines, we're usually working with several different lots that are then getting blended together, but they're all coming off of, one particular site. And so it's a blending within a vineyard block or within a vineyard versus blending across vineyards and across varietals. And so blending, just talking about Onda as an example, the second wine that we tasted, well, it sort of has its heart at Crystal Springs and that little bit warmer, broader, more expansive feel to the tannins versus Vasa, which is a little bit creamier, but a little bit more central and linear, having a little bit more high altitude feel to it, a little bit more of a savory component to the wine.
Definitely, there's that lift that you're describing.
Really working to try to balance some of that power with a finesse. So being able to blend in a little bit of Merlot or Cab Franc as well as maybe a little bit of Rutherford fruit to add maybe a little bit more of a floral aromatic to make the aromatics a little bit more refined or elegant. And how the different places can be complementary to each other in kind of capturing sort of the vintage and all of our estate versus a very hyper-specific place that has a very specific personality that I'm trying to capture. And so it's sort of a summation of the family versus of one individual. So thinking about the individual vineyards as almost as individual people, but then how do they work together kind of as a team in the blended wines.
How much of that really art form is instinct and how much of it is informed by other factors, like when you're actually in the thick of blending?
I say a lot of it is just sort of, this comes down to the sort of more intuitive piece, right? So like you taste the wine, you go like, yeah, that feels like Hershey, or nah, it just doesn't quite feel like Hershey. And so like there's a lot of that's intuitive.
Yeah. Do you continue tweaking it, or do you just know when you got it right and you leave it alone?
No, my sort of analytical background can't leave it alone.
So you probably stop.
Oftentimes it's in the first blending session that I'll come up with what's the final wine, but like there'll be 20 iterations. But that wine will usually be, in all those iterations, we'll keep coming back to it. And so oftentimes it's one of those first wines that is the final wine, but not always. So like I find value in the sort of that iterative process, and it's also learning and fun. One of the funnest things about winemaking is like putting blends together. And just like seeing how the different components work together, because it's a non-linear or additive process.
I'm sure. Seeing all your hard work came together and being able to play with different lots and such like that. So in terms of the future, clearly there's a long-term vision, like you said, generational, which is, I applaud it because I think it's a very healthy philosophy. People talk about sustainability and such like that, but what is the underlying theme of all of that? What is the reason? It's really, you want to create something that can provide something of substance and value in the future, just like that 29 Lafite, right? So if you can make the wine that somebody could open and in 60 or 70 year time will put a smile on their face and potentially change their career path and maybe their entire life. That's a pretty exciting proposition. But incrementally, as you
if I only do that once in my entire career, and I won't be here to see it, but that I would say that's a success.
Wow. So you just told me what your definition of success is, it sounds like, which is something I was going to ask you. Incrementally, as you move forward, what are some of the goalposts as the brand evolves and develops?
Well, I think one of the things is to really make sure that as the brand develops, especially for Vaso, is to make sure that the wine retains its personality and kind of its character, and that it sort of lives up to the philosophical underpinnings that kind of gave it birth. And I think that's something that sometimes is very difficult that's a difficult path sometimes, because there's sometimes a desire, if you're, trying to, produce a little bit more of the wine, to sort of lose that focus, that laser focus on making sure that philosophically it's still what you set out to do. And that's not to say that there's no room for change and improvement, because as we've talked about, there's a constant ability. You should always be looking at trying to improve things, and there's always a room for doing slightly better than you did before. But I think one of the things that I always get concerned about is, do you lose sight of the forest when you're looking at the trees, kind of a thing. You
Yeah.
get bogged down in the details of like, how am I going to do these things without keeping that bigger vision in mind.
Yeah, no, I really love what I'm hearing. There's clearly that evolutionary progression, but it's rooted in the fundamentals, the integrity, that really underlines and underscores everything that I've experienced here today. I'm very excited and I look forward to tasting the vintages and having more conversations with you. Thank you very much for all the insight. It is immensely impressive, but there's a lot of heart, a lot of intent, which is something that to me is perhaps the most important part of our industry, is the human terroir. And you've embraced it fully, and it shows up in a glass. So I urge you guys to try the wines. I think you will find your own story in them. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.